The rain came down like a soft verdict, beating the highway in slow, steady strokes that turned headlights into halos and turned the world into a smudged watercolor. He was late for the night shift again, the kind of late that settled into the bones and refused to leave. The steering wheel under his palms felt familiar and small, a life driven in careful turns, 3 small savings jars on the kitchen shelf calling out to be filled, rent, medicine, school fees. The road carved through the sleeping suburbs, and his thoughts traced the same worn loops. His wife's cough, his son's homework, the rent notice folded between the pages of an old religious calendar. Outside, the rain blurred everything into a single urgent task: arrive, work, return, sleep, repeat. Then the car slowed. A hazard light blinked like a tiny surrendered star on the shoulder. A woman stood beside a flat tire, shoulders wrapped in a coat that did little against the damp. She balanced a small duffel as if it were an anchor, the kind of bag that could contain a life in transit or a story being carried from one place to another. Her face was under the hood of a baseball cap pulled low, rain beating on the brim. Cars sped by, their windows false candles of indifference. In that stretch of wet loneliness, most people counted their luck and moved on. He had been taught to see the world as an unfinished ledger, kindness matched by need, debts settled in small daily exchanges. He stopped without thinking, the engine's hum cutting into the rain like a promise. He offered the space he could spare, a wrench, 2 spare hands, the kind of attention that costs nothing and is worth everything. He stepped into the rain, feeling it soak through the edges of common sense, and walked toward the woman. Fixing a tire under a leaking sky becomes an intimate ritual between strangers. The air smelled of wet rubber and gasoline and something cleaner, the immediate satisfaction of a problem solved. He tightened lug nuts with patient thumb and palm, found the culprit, a nail like a tiny, stubborn truth embedded where it hurt, and changed the wheel as if it were something the world owed no explanations for. The woman watched with an expression that shifted from annoyance to relief to something like recognition, and when the new tire was seated and the car lowered back to its proper level, she reached into her bag for a folded paper and opened it, as if to offer thanks. He shook his head, palms up, refusing payment the way some people refuse medals. The woman hesitated, then did what strangers sometimes do in moments that feel larger than convenience. She revealed a name. It was the name of a project, then the name of a company, then the weight of a camera crew and a scheduled meeting that she could not now make. There was apology in the tilt of her head and gratitude in the damp fingers she extended. He waved her off with the modesty of those who have learned to survive on small mercies. She thanked him with a look that lingered, heavy as if it had come bearing information that he drove on, rain wipers marking time, and the night swallowed the little exchange. For a long while after, the image of the woman stayed with him like a light that refused to be turned off. The shape of her coat, the way her voice might have sounded, the business card that had been offered and then tucked away. He reached home with a clothesline of rain still clinging to his jacket, and his apartment greeted him with the same essential facts: a swollen bill, a cough that required a late-night trip to the medicine cabinet, a small boy asleep with his homework half unfinished, and a pencil tucked behind his ear like a promise. Days passed. The image of the woman returned at odd intervals, not as an obligation but as an unsettled question. Then, on a Tuesday that smelled of laundry detergent and something like fate, a letter arrived. It was formal in tone, printed on thick paper, and at the top a logo he did not recognize. Inside, a photograph of the same woman leaned against the edge of the page. For the first time, he saw her face clear and deliberate, not under a hat and not blurred by rain. The letter requested a meeting, promising no pomp or pretense, only the honest exchange of time for a matter of consequence. Curiosity sharpened into necessity. He went to the meeting with the reluctance of someone who has been taught to step lightly across thresholds of power. They met in a modest office where rain-slicked leaves clung to the pavement outside, and a kettle hissed in a kitchen that smelled faintly of citrus. The woman unrolled a small map of the town, the place where factories lined the river like a row of old teeth, where men and women earned their lives in shifts measured by machines and time cards. The map had pins on it, clusters where tragedies and dismissals and subcontracted labor generated a pattern that was ugly and precise. He pointed to a pin, The name of the factory where his friend had fallen ill after years of exposure to fumes. The same factory that had laid people off last winter and blamed falling orders. He spoke without flourish, listing by memory the small injustices that aggregate into ruin. Delayed paychecks, unpaid overtime, safety protocols that existed only on paper. His voice was even, the way people speak when they have rehearsed these truths in private all their lives. The woman listened in the way people who have seen much human suffering listen, not with pity but with the rare, dangerous interest of someone who believes stories change things. She took notes, not as a bureaucrat, but as a witness. Later, she showed him a short clip on a tablet, footage of a worker coughing in a corner, a supervisor closing a door, a ledger with erased numbers. It was evidence, and it was also an invitation to justice. She explained, without spectacle, without a show of righteous indignation, that she made documentaries about communities ruined by negligent corporations, about the slow erosion of dignity by systems that treated people as expendable. She said she was gathering stories to connect the dots, to hold names accountable where names deserve to be held accountable, that it would have been easy for him to be skeptical. Promises are cheaper than bread. But there was an honesty in the way she had accepted his help without asking, and a humility in her willingness to come back in the rain. He told her about his wife, the cough that had elicited nothing but a nepotistic form letter from the factory clinic, the medicine they had to choose between buying and not buying. He spoke of his son and a scholarship application left incomplete because paying for transport had taken precedence. The woman watched him, not as someone sizing up a story, but as someone recognizing the weight of the human ledger he had carried. The project unfurled like a slow breeze across a parched field. Cameras arrived, but they arrived sensitively, as if a presence could be unobtrusive. Interviews were held, not just with him, but with others who had quietly collected evidence in the margins. A nurse who had kept receipts, a retired foreman who had seen corners cut, a seamstress whose daughter had left home to find work elsewhere because wages could not support two mouths. The film stitched together the small indignities into a tapestry that was impossible to ignore. In the editing room, an invisible hand took all those private grievances and made them public, not for sensation but for reckonings that might bring relief. When the documentary premiered online, it traveled with the speed of an idea that finds oxygen. Viewers watched and then shared again. A local human rights group picked up the thread and pressed charges. Lawyers arrived with more paper than he had ever seen stacked in one room. The factory's management issued a statement, precise and measured, but it could not counteract the weight of filmed testimony. Donations and legal aid filtered into the town. A fund for medical bills was established, and the hospital scheduled free screenings for workers. The scholarship his son needed was quietly funded by a trust that preferred anonymity, and when the first check arrived, the relief it carried felt like sunlight entering a dim room. The unexpected had arrived in the most ordinary way. A wrench, a spare tire, hands that were willing. The woman, whose name finally landed into his life like an anchor, had not offered a miracle. She had offered attention, which is often the first step toward justice. She had used the tiny moment of a tire changed in a storm as a conduit to something greater, to accountability, to repair. The moral of that small evening was not that kindness buys reward, but that kindness can be the axis around which justice turns. His act had not been strategic or dramatic. It had been human. His reward came in the form of a community restored piece by piece. A son with a better chance, a wife with access to care, a town that refused to be silent. He kept the business card in his wallet next to the photograph of his family. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain returned and the roads gleamed, he would think of the chain of small decencies that had led to this repair. The world, he had learned, could be altered by the smallest gestures when someone else was watching and willing to amplify what they saw. It was not instantaneous justice, and it was not perfect, but it was a correction, a modern kind of karma that rewarded decency with the slow, steady administration of fairness. The chapter closed not with fanfare, but with the gentle knowledge that life could pivot on small choices, and that a stranger's gratitude could open doors for an entire family. The road ahead remained long and full of weather, but the map of his life had shifted just enough to make room for hope.